End quote. Sir, you need to step away from that shoreline right now. Or, I'm calling the county sheriff for criminal trespassing. End quote. That was the very first thing I heard after driving 22 hours straight to reach the only place on earth that still felt like home. And honestly, looking at the woman standing there, you'd have thought I just walked into her living room with muddy boots instead of standing on a patch of dirt my family has owned since the Roaring '20s. Her name was Victoria Sterling, though I didn't know it yet. And she was the kind of person who wore a crisp white linen suit to a mountain lake and smelled so strongly of expensive lilies that it actually fought with the scent of the pine needles. She was blocking my path to the water, clutching an iPad like a shield and waving a plastic HOA badge as if it gave her the power of a high court judge, while her white Mercedes SUV sat idling behind her, looking completely out of place against the rugged backdrop of the Sierra Nevadas. I just stood there for a second, my old Ford F-150 still ticking as the engine cooled. And I looked at her, then at the water, then back at her, wondering how on earth we'd gotten to a point where a stranger could tell me I didn't in oppos. Belong on my own soul soil. End quote. Ma'am, end quote. I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the exhaustion deep in my bones. End quote. You're threatening to arrest a man for using the very water his great-grandfather paid for in gold coins back when Calvin Coolidge was in the White House, so maybe we should both take a breath, end quote. My name is Elias Thorne, and a few months ago, I was a man who had lost just about everything. A 20-year marriage that ended in a cold courtroom, half of my land surveying firm, and a good chunk of my self-respect. I came to Blackwood Lake because I inherited 3,000 acres of pristine wilderness and a body of water so deep and blue it looks like a fallen piece of the sky, thinking I found a sanctuary where I could lick my wounds and figure out who I was again. What I did in Anapos, to expect, was that while my family had been away, a group of developers had built a high-end playground called the Ridges around the perimeter, erecting a gated community of $850 million homes for people who assumed that, because they bought a view, they bought the lake too. Victoria Sterling had been the HOA president for a decade, a former corporate litigator who ran the neighborhood like a private fiefdom, and she had spent years convincing everyone that the lake was their private asset, a lie that was about to cost them every bit of their waterfront piece. You see, land surveying ISN into oppos. It's just about measuring dirt. It's about reading the history written in the rocks and the old iron pipes buried in the ground. And as I looked past Victoria's shaking iPad, I saw something that made my professional blood run cold. Down by the shore, heavy machinery was groaning, and a crew was pouring concrete for a massive new community boat launch right in the middle of a delicate wetland area that fed the lake's ecosystem. They were digging into my lake bottom, destroying native vegetation that had been there for a century, all because Victoria wanted end quote, grand entrance, end quote, for the summer season, and she hadn't oppos. Bothered to check if she actually had the right to touch a single pebble below the high water mark. I pulled out the original 1923 deed, protected in a weathered leather sleeve, a document that specifically granted the Thorne family, end quote, exclusive surface water rights and all mineral interests in perpetuity, end quote. But Victoria didn't oppos to even glance at it. She just sneered at my work shirt and my calloused hands and told me that, end quote, old papers don and oppos. Supersede modern community standards, end quote. It was that particular brand of condescension, that look she gave me like I was a stray dog. Wandering into a gala, that and oppos. That's when I realized I was an oppos. Just fighting for a lake. I was fighting for the legacy of the man who hauled timber and broke his back so I could have a place to stand. I left that morning without a fight because I'm a man who believes in a measured response. But 3 days later, end quote, cease and desist, end quote. Letter arrived at my cabin that was so thick it could have been a novel, claiming the HOA had established, end quote, adverse possession, end quote, through decades of continuous use. They were trying to fine me $5,000 a day for even stepping on the shore, and they'd hired a Shark Tank law firm out of the city to bury me in paperwork before I could even find a lawyer of my own. That's when I met Arthur, a retired judge who lived in Lot 412, a guy who had spent 40 years on the bench and was currently being fined by Victoria because his mailbox was, in quote, the wrong shade of forest green, end quote, Arthur sat on my porch, sipping a beer and looking at the HOA's legal threat, and he started laughing so hard he nearly choked because he knew what Victoria didn't in oppose. Western water law is a beast that doesn't in oppose. Care about your, end quote, community standards, end quote, and doctrine of, end quote, first in time, first and right, end quote, is the iron rule of the mountains. He told me, end quote, Elias, they've spent 37 years selling these people the idea of an oppose, lakefront living and oppose, but the HOA's own incorporation papers never mention water ownership because they never had it to begin with. They've been selling a dream they didn't and oppose, own, and they've been charging people millions in fees to maintain property that belongs to you. End quote. The scale of the fraud was staggering. When I did the math with Arthur, we realized the HOA had collected nearly $80 million in, end quote, lake maintenance and access fees, end quote, since the 80s, money that had disappeared into, end quote, beautification projects, end quote, and Victoria's various whims, all while they were technically trespassing on Thornland every single time a resident launched a boat. I decided to play it quiet for a while, spending my mornings with my surveying transit and my GPS gear, meticulously mapping the exact boundary lines while Victoria watched me through binoculars from her balcony like a hawk guarding a nest. Every time a security guard approached me, I'd just hand them a copy of the federal land patent and keep working, documenting the environmental damage those construction crews were doing to the wetlands. I watched as they dumped tons of unwashed gravel into the spawning grounds of the local trout, the acrid smell of diesel fuel floating over the water that used to smell like nothing but cold air and pine sap, and I felt a slow, cold anger building in my chest, the kind of anger that doesn't end oppose, shout but waits. The turning point came when Victoria decided to get personal. She sent out a community-wide email blast featuring a photo of me, calling me a, end quote, legal predator, end quote, and an, end quote, outside agitator, end quote, who was trying to, end quote, extort the hard-working families of the ridges, end quote. Neighbors who used to wave and I drove by started turning their heads, and someone even threw a rock through the window of my truck while I was at the grocery store, but the more they pushed, the more Arthur and I dug into the archives. We found a series of emails leaked by a disgruntled former board member that showed Victoria knew about the water rights issue 5 years ago and chose to bury it, worried that if the truth came out, property values would crater and the HOA would be sued into oblivion. She was doubling down on the lie, betting everything that end quote, dirt poor surveyor, end quote, wouldn't end oppose. Have a stomach for $1 million lawsuit, but she forgot that I had nothing left to lose and a century of history in my back. I called in the big guns, not a lawyer, but a state environmental inspector named Sarah who had a reputation for being as tough as a mountain lion and twice as fast, and I invited her for a, end quote, site visit, end quote, on the same day Victoria was hosting a, end quote, grand opening, end quote, for the new boat launch. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, the kind where the sun glints off the water like diamonds, and there were at least 200 people there in their sundresses and polo shirts, drinking champagne and celebrating their, end quote, private, end quote, lake. Victoria was mid-speech, talking about how the HOA had, end quote, secured the future of the community, end quote, when Sarah and 2 sheriff's deputies walked right through the middle of the crowd, past the catering tables, and slapped a red, end quote, stop work, end quote, ordered directly onto the fresh concrete of the boat ramp. The silence that followed was so heavy you could hear the wind whistling through the pines, and when Sarah explained, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that the construction was a, end quote, felony violation of protected wetlands, end quote, and that the HOA was being fined $250,000 effective immediately, Victoria's face went from a triumphant red to a ghostly, chalky white. That was just the opening act, though. The Real, end quote, nuclear option, end quote, was the annual community meeting 2 weeks later, which I attended with a rolling suitcase full of evidence and Arthur sitting right beside me. Victoria tried to block me at the door, her eyes wild and her hair finally out of place, screaming that I was and oppose. A member of the association and had no right to speak, but the sheriff was there too, and he reminded her that I was the largest landowner in the county and that this was a, end quote, lawful assembly, end quote. I stood in front of those 800 people who had spent their life savings to live there, And I showed them the 1923 deed, the 1987 fraud, and the secret emails where their board had laughed about, in quote, keeping the rubes in the dark, in quote, about the water rights. I told them, in quote, I don and oppose. T want your money and I don and oppose. T want to take your homes. But as of 5 minutes ago, I filed a quiet title lawsuit that will strip this HOA of every ounce of authority over this lake forever, unless you remove this board today and agree to a total environmental restoration of the land they've spent 30 years destroying. End quote. The explosion of noise in that room was unlike anything I've ever heard. It wasn't an oppose, a protest against me. It was a riot against the woman who had lied to them while taking their money. And when Victoria tried to grab the microphone to scream one last time about, in quote, community standards, in quote, she was drowned out by the sound of 800 voices demanding her resignation. She ended up being escorted out by the deputies after she tried to physically assault the treasurer, and the footage of her being led away in handcuffs, still screaming that the, end quote, lake belongs to the elite, end quote, went viral across the state by the next morning. It took 6 months to clean up the mess she left behind. But today, Blackwood Lake is finally what it was meant to be, a place of peace where the wetlands are thriving again, where the trout are spawning in clear water, and where the, end quote, private, end quote, gates have been replaced by a sign that says, end quote, nature belongs to those who respect it, end quote. I still live in my cabin, and sometimes, late at night, I'll see a light on in one of those $1,000,000 houses, and I'll wonder if they ever realize that the best things in life can't oppose. To be bought with a deed or protected by a plastic badge. They have to be earned through stewardship and truth. The HOA is gone now, replaced by a conservation trust that I chair, and the people who live here have learned that, in quote, Waterfront rights, in quote, don and oppose. T mean a thing if you and oppose, re-drowning in lies. But it makes me think how many other, in quote, communities, in quote, out there are built on a foundation of sand? If you found out your entire neighborhood was a legal fiction, would you fight for the truth, or would you keep paying the fees just to keep the dream alive? Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you'd been in my shoes. Would you have sued them for every penny of that 80 million, or would you have done what I did and traded the money for the soul of the lake? Subscribe for more stories from the Surveyor's Trail, and remember, the land always has the final word.